My commute to work had been getting increasingly longer and more unpredictable over the past year. This was mainly due to 4 bridge closures that occurred within a few months or weeks of each other. The closures were sudden, and no reopening dates had been announced. As a result, unless I left for work 1 or 2 hours earlier, I ran the risk of being late by 1 to 5 minutes once or twice a week. The traffic delays were something that impacted everyone in one way or another, making it impossible for anyone to claim ignorance. However, there was one coworker, let's call her Karen, who didn't seem to care about valid reasons for being slightly late. Karen went behind my back and complained so persistently that my immediate supervisor eventually felt compelled to write me up. I had no doubt that Karen was the one behind the complaints. Her behavior made it obvious. Whenever anyone brought up the traffic situation, Karen would leave the room abruptly, interrupt the conversation with irrelevant comments or questions, or roll her eyes in exasperation. She was notorious for complaining about nearly everything. Despite Karen's attitude, I genuinely enjoyed my job. To avoid giving her any more reasons to complain, I decided to adjust my schedule. I started leaving for work an hour and a half earlier than I had before. This new routine ensured that I consistently arrived anywhere between 15 and 45 minutes before my shift started. It was during this time that I began to notice something interesting about Karen. She always arrived about 10 minutes before her shift and had a preferred parking spot on the street right outside the building. It wasn't an assigned parking space, it was a public spot, but she seemed to have unofficially claimed it as her own. Before the traffic situation worsened, I used to park on a different side of the building and had never noticed this habit of hers. Now that I was arriving earlier, I had my pick of parking spots, including Karen's favorite one. So, I started parking there every day. It wasn't out of necessity, it was purely out of spite. Since Karen had made such a fuss about my tardiness, I figured this was a small way to get back at her. Because I was now consistently early to work, Karen couldn't complain about my punctuality anymore. I made sure to mention my early arrival times casually in conversations with other coworkers while Karen was within earshot. This way, she knew that not only was I early, but I was also deliberately taking her usual parking spot. I have no idea if Karen ever complained to our supervisor about me parking in her spot. Honestly, I hoped she did because it would highlight just how petty and ridiculous she was being. After all, it was a public parking spot, and she had no rightful claim to it. Taking her spot became my small act of rebellion against her unnecessary complaints. It felt good to turn the tables on someone who had made things difficult for me. In fact, I even considered taking things a step further. I thought about requesting to start my shift 30 minutes earlier. That way, I could leave earlier too, solidifying my claim to the parking spot forever. Karen's constant need to complain had backfired spectacularly, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction every time I parked in her spot. It wasn't just about the parking, it was about standing up to someone who went out of their way to make my life harder for no good reason. Many years ago, I worked at a small gas station. It wasn't anything fancy, just a satellite location for a nearby grocery store. Essentially, it was a tiny kiosk surrounded by a dozen pumps. I have plenty of stories from my time there, but there's one in particular that stands out and fits perfectly for this situation. At this gas station, my coworkers ranged from genuinely cool people to completely useless ones. This story revolves around one of the latter, a coworker we'll call Sandy. Sandy wasn't new to the job itself, she had transferred over from another station within the company. However, from day one, she was a problem. Sandy had her own way of doing things, and instead of adapting to how we operated at our station, she expected everyone else to adjust to her methods. She acted like she was the boss, even though she wasn't, and it rubbed everyone the wrong way. One Friday afternoon, Sandy and I were scheduled to work the shift together. Our station usually operated with just 2 employees per shift, so we had to cover for each other's breaks. I had no problem with this arrangement, I was a team player, and I usually took my breaks in the small office at the back. If my coworker needed me, all they had to do was yell, and I'd be there. However, Sandy decided to take both her breaks at once that day. Normally, if we wanted to combine our half-hour lunch break with our 15-minute break, we had to clear it with our coworker first. It wasn't technically allowed by company policy, but most of us didn't care about that as long as it was mutually agreed upon. Sandy, of course, didn't bother asking for permission. She decided to take her extended break right before rush hour, the busiest time of the day when we'd have the highest volume of customers. It was a terrible time to leave one person alone to manage the station, but Sandy didn't care. She told me she'd take her break first, and I could take mine afterward. I agreed, thinking it wouldn't be an issue. Half an hour passed, and Sandy didn't come back. Another half hour went by, my break time, and still no sign of her. After an additional 15 minutes, Sandy finally returned. She walked in, took her place behind the register, and acted as if nothing was wrong. There was no apology for taking a longer break than agreed or for coming back late. When I brought up the fact that she had left me to handle the station alone during rush hour, Sandy dismissed it entirely. "I don't know why you're getting so pissy," she said. "All you ever do is sit in the back anyway. I wouldn't get upset if you took a long break." Her attitude infuriated me, but instead of arguing, I decided to hold her to her word. If she was okay with me taking an extra long break, then that's exactly what I'd do. I walked out of the station, bought a newspaper, and went to a nearby Japanese restaurant. I ordered a big bowl of noodles and vegetables, sat down, and took my time enjoying my meal. I made sure to stay away for exactly 45 minutes, the same amount of time Sandy had taken for her unapproved break. When I returned to the station, I found Sandy missing from the register. Instead, our manager, Tammy, was there. Apparently, Sandy couldn't handle the workload on her own and had broken down in tears. She had called Tammy for help, and Tammy had driven into town to take over. Tammy was furious, not at me, but at Sandy. She sent Sandy home immediately and stayed behind to ensure everything was running smoothly. Once the rush died down, Tammy reviewed the security footage to confirm what had happened. Sandy had told her that I had taken an unapproved break during rush hour because I didn't want to work. However, the footage clearly showed that Sandy was the one who left the station understaffed. She had lied to Tammy, and the evidence was undeniable. The next day, Sandy was reprimanded for her behavior. Between the long, unapproved break, the lying, and her inability to handle the station on her own, she was fired. Tammy had no tolerance for employees who couldn't handle their responsibilities, and Sandy had already been on thin ice due to her previous behavior. This entire situation was a classic example of malicious compliance. Sandy had tried to manipulate the situation to her advantage, but it backfired spectacularly. She thought she could take advantage of me, but instead, her actions exposed her incompetence and dishonesty. Looking back, I can't help but smile at how things played out. Cameras truly are a liar's worst enemy, and in this case, they ensured that justice was served. Sandy's downfall wasn't just a result of her poor decisions, it was also a reminder that sometimes, all you need to do is let people dig their own graves. I used to work a retail job in Los Angeles, and one day, our boss decided to hire a new assistant manager. The new hire was the quintessential Karen, blonde, apparently in her 40s but insisting she was 33, and recently divorced from her wealthy Beverly Hills husband. It was obvious that this was her first time actually having to work for a living, and she carried herself with an air of entitlement that rubbed everyone the wrong way. Karen's behavior became problematic almost immediately. During her first week, she made the mistake of leaving her expensive Louis Vuitton purse wide open on the break room table. Instead of securing it in her assigned locker, she left it out in the open where anyone could access it. Predictably, someone stole $200 from her purse. Now, let's be clear, the thief was in the wrong for taking what didn't belong to them. But Karen's response to the situation was, to put it bluntly, ridiculous. Instead of taking responsibility for her carelessness, she implemented a new policy: no one could enter the break room without her explicit permission. Her reasoning was that by monitoring who entered and exited the room, she could identify the culprit if anything else was stolen. This policy didn't make much sense, especially since Karen wasn't in the store at all times. How could she possibly enforce it when she wasn't there? More importantly, the rest of us were now being punished for something that wasn't our fault. Understandably, this didn't sit well with the staff. And so, we decided to fight back, with malicious compliance. If Karen wanted to micromanage access to the break room, we'd make her life as difficult as possible. Every time we needed to use the break room for any reason, we interrupted Karen to ask for permission. Whether it was to wash our sticky hands in the sink, get a drink of water, grab the broom to clean up a spill, or throw something away in the trash can, we made sure to inform Karen and wait for her approval. This constant interruption completely derailed Karen's workflow. She was so preoccupied with granting access to the break room that she could barely complete her own tasks. Inventory checks, paperwork, and other managerial duties took a backseat as Karen found herself playing gatekeeper for the break room. It wasn't long before she reached her breaking point. The no entry without permission policy lasted a grand total of 3 days. By the end of the 3rd day, Karen was so frustrated that she abandoned the policy entirely. However, the damage was already done. The experience of managing a retail store full of lowly common folk was too much for Karen to handle. She quit shortly afterward, leaving us to resume our jobs without her micromanagement. Karen's brief tenure as assistant manager was a classic example of how not to lead a team. Instead of addressing the theft in a constructive way, she chose to punish everyone for her own mistake. Her overbearing policies and condescending attitude alienated the staff and ultimately made her own job unbearable. In the end, Karen's downfall was her own doing, and I can't say any of us were sad to see her go. Looking back, I can't help but laugh at the absurdity of the situation. Karen's response to the theft was the epitome of a knee-jerk reaction, and her attempt to assert control only highlighted her lack of leadership skills. If anything, she taught us an important lesson: sometimes, the best way to deal with a Karen is to let her policies speak for themselves. When given enough rope, she'll inevitably hang herself. For a bit of context, I'm a 25-year-old woman who works as part of the sanitation department at a hospital. Our department is responsible for maintaining the cleanliness of various areas, including nurses' stations, patient rooms, hallways, bathrooms, and more. This involves tasks like taking out trash, replacing linen, and cleaning floors. My role is what we call a float worker, which means I've been trained in all the different areas and can cover for anyone who's out sick, on vacation, or taking days off. Being a float worker has its perks and challenges. On one hand, I get to see different parts of the hospital and build rapport with the staff across multiple departments. On the other hand, I have to keep track of the specific needs and procedures for nearly 30 different areas. Sometimes I need to ask my supervisors for a refresher on what needs to be done, especially if I'm covering an area I haven't worked in recently. The downside of my position is that I don't know where I'll be assigned until I show up for my shift. I don't mind this uncertainty too much, though, because it keeps things interesting. About a year and a half ago, I was scheduled to cover for someone in the operating room, or, for an entire month. The sanitation team consists of 4 people, one starts at 6 a.m., my position begins at 8 a.m., and the other 2 positions start at 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. I didn't mind this assignment since I was familiar with the staff and enjoyed working with them. Plus, the workload is usually manageable, with plenty of downtime between cases. However, there was one major downside to working in the a coworker we'll call Steve. Steve, who works the afternoon shift from 11 a.m. to 7:30 p.m., is a notorious troublemaker. He's the kind of person who looks down on others, especially if they're struggling or falling behind on tasks. If you were even slightly slow in completing a job, he'd immediately call the supervisor to report you. On top of that, Steve had a habit of making demeaning comments, particularly toward women. He told me on multiple occasions that I wasn't built for working, and that I should be at home in the kitchen preparing dinner for my husband. Steve's constant tattling and condescending remarks made him universally disliked, and many people avoided learning or sanitation procedures just to avoid working with him. The other or staff had learned to ignore him, but I decided to take a different approach. I'd have a little fun at his expense whenever I could. The first week of my month-long or assignment went smoothly. I worked diligently and didn't give Steve any reason to comment on my performance. However, during the second week, things took a turn. That week happened to be one of the busiest weeks of the year for the OR. On average, the OR handles about 35 cases a day across its 10 rooms. That week, we were handling an average of 52 cases a day. Rooms were turning over at record speed as doctors and nurses rushed to complete cases and leave before additional cases could be added. The workload was intense, and our team of 4 was struggling to keep up. By noon, I had just finished cleaning 2 rooms and decided to take a quick round of my assigned area to make sure everything was in order before heading to lunch. After confirming that my area was as clean as it could be under the circumstances, I informed my coworkers that I was heading to lunch. Everyone was fine with this, except Steve. Steve stopped me and asked, "Did you check your sinks?" I replied that I had scrubbed them before the morning rush. He then asked, "What about the trash cans?" I told him I had already checked them and that one was only half full, so it wouldn't be a problem for the next 30 minutes. Steve continued to question me, asking if I had dusted the hallways or cleaned the high-touch surfaces. Frustrated, I finally said, "Steve, mind your own business. You're not my boss. Worry about your own area." I walked away and went to the OR break room, where I began my lunch. About 10 minutes into my break, our department director walked in, tapped me on the shoulder, and asked me to meet her in her office after lunch. When I asked what it was about, she said we'd discuss it later. Annoyed but not surprised, I knew Steve must have complained about me. This wasn't the first time he'd tried to stir up trouble. Steve had a history of exaggerating situations and making baseless complaints to management. I figured he had probably told the director that I had been rude or uncooperative, and I braced myself for the fallout. As I finished my meal, I glanced at the monitor displaying the OR schedule. All the rooms were closing their cases, which meant my team was about to be slammed with new patients. Normally, I would have felt bad about leaving my coworkers to handle the workload without me, but considering Steve's behavior, I couldn't help but smile. He had brought this on himself. On my way to the director's office, I passed by Steve, who was visibly stressed as the workload began to pile up. He stopped me and demanded to know where I was going. "I'm heading to the director's office," I replied. She asked to see me right after lunch. "Good luck handling the rooms." Steve's face turned red with frustration, but there was nothing he could do. I continued to the director's office, where I found her waiting with an HR representative. As I sat down, she explained that someone, though she didn't name names, had reported me for creating a hostile work environment. I couldn't help but laugh as I recounted my side of the story, detailing Steve's constant micromanagement and inappropriate comments. As I sat in the director's office, I could tell she was trying to remain professional, but she seemed exhausted by the situation. After hearing my account of what happened, she put her head in her hands while the HR representative stifled a chuckle. It was clear they had heard enough about Steve to know this wasn't an isolated incident. I asked, "Am I going to lose my job over this?" The director shook her head and explained that the initial plan was to place a strike on my record and assign me some online training courses about workplace conflict resolution. However, after hearing my side of the story and reviewing other reports about Steve's behavior, she realized that the real issue wasn't me, it was him. She admitted that she shouldn't have involved HR without first getting my perspective. Relieved, I nodded and thanked her for understanding. I got up to leave but hesitated for a moment. Then, I turned back to her and said, "Actually, I'd like to file a formal complaint about Steve." The director raised her eyebrows but motioned for me to sit back down. "Go on," she said. I began listing all of the grievances I'd collected against Steve during my time working in the OR. The list included micromanagement of co-workers. Steve constantly hovered over others, questioning their methods and slowing them down. Creating a hostile work environment. His incessant criticism and unnecessary reporting made the workplace unbearable for many. Unnecessary and excessive reporting to supervisors. Steve had a habit of escalating trivial issues to management. Workplace bullying. His demeaning comments, particularly toward women, were out of line. Misogyny. Steve frequently made remarks implying that women didn't belong in physically demanding jobs. Sexual misconduct. On one occasion, he told me, "You probably like other women because you don't have a guy who can satisfy you." I provided specific examples and approximate dates for each of these incidents. As I spoke, the director's expression shifted from disbelief to frustration. By the time I finished, she was shaking her head and massaging her temples. I could tell she was regretting not addressing Steve's behavior sooner. "It's a bad day to be Steve," I said with a small smile. She nodded and replied, "Yes, it is." The director assured me that she would speak to Steve before the end of the day and address the issues I had raised. Feeling satisfied, I left her office and headed back to the OR. By the time I returned, my team looked utterly drained. Even the morning shift worker, a seasoned veteran with over a decade of experience, appeared exhausted. They had managed to clean all the rooms, but the effort had clearly taken a toll on them. Steve was the first to speak. "Took you long enough." "Where were you?" he asked, his voice tinged with irritation. "Oh, don't worry," I replied with a grin. "You'll find out soon enough." My meeting with the director went really well. The morning shift worker, curious, asked what had happened. I explained. Someone filed a complaint about me being aggressive, and it turned into a discussion about eliminating the hostile work environment. Hearing this, Steve smiled smugly and said, "Good. The last thing we need is someone making people feel uncomfortable up here." I couldn't resist the opportunity to needle him further. "Oh, absolutely, Steve," I said. "We wouldn't want anyone feeling attacked or disrespected, right? Oh, by the way, have you checked the break room lately? Last I saw, the trash was overflowing onto the floor." Steve's face turned pale as he rushed to the break room to inspect the trash situation. Meanwhile, the rest of us burst into laughter. It was a small victory, but it felt incredibly satisfying. Later, the director followed up with me about the actions taken against Steve. She explained that while my complaints were taken seriously, they couldn't fire him outright because I was the only one who had formally come forward. Without corroborating reports from other employees, they couldn't justify immediate termination. However, Steve wasn't let off the hook entirely. Steve was hit with 2 strikes, a third would result in automatic termination, and was required to complete a year's worth of online training courses on workplace behavior, discrimination, and harassment. He was also explicitly warned that any future inappropriate comments would result in his immediate dismissal and blacklisting from hospitals across the state. On a personal level, things improved significantly for me after that incident. I was promoted to a lead position on the day shift, which came with a pay raise and additional responsibilities. Although I still retained my float status, the title gave me more authority to stand up to people like Steve. Most importantly, it gave me the confidence to navigate workplace conflicts without fear of retaliation. As for Steve, his behavior changed dramatically after the reprimand. He became more cautious and less overbearing, though it was clear he resented me for standing up to him. I didn't mind, it was a small price to pay for a more peaceful work environment. This next story takes place a couple of years ago, during a time when I worked for a company that handled media design, graphic design, photography, live event AV, video editing, you name it, I did it. The company hosted large-scale events, and over the years, my role expanded to include responsibilities far beyond my job description. By the time I left, I was essentially doing the work of 4 people. To make matters worse, the company didn't invest in any of the necessary materials or equipment for my work. Instead, I had to pay for everything out of pocket. Over time, I built up an impressive collection of high-end media equipment, all purchased second-hand or on sale, and every single piece of it was labeled with my name to ensure it wouldn't be misplaced if I lent it out. By the 5th year of working there, I had accumulated thousands of dollars worth of equipment, which became an integral part of the company's promotional and event production efforts. One day, seemingly out of nowhere, I was called into my boss's office. She informed me that the company was downsizing and that they had decided to replace me with someone fresh out of college, someone younger and cheaper. This new hire had little to no real-world experience but was expected to take over not only my job but also the responsibilities of several other positions. I was blindsided by this decision. I had dedicated years of my life to this company, going above and beyond to ensure its success, and this was how they repaid me. Before I could process what was happening, someone from corporate was assigned to escort me to my office and supervise me as I packed up my belongings. "Take everything that's yours," the corporate guy said, making it clear that I wouldn't be coming back. So, that's exactly what I did. They expected me to leave with just a box of personal items, a few photos, maybe a plant, but they had no idea how much of the company's equipment was actually mine. As I began packing up my office, the reality of the situation started to dawn on my boss. Every camera, every lens, every piece of AV gear, nearly all of it belonged to me. I calmly explained this to the corporate representative, assuring him that I had receipts to prove ownership if necessary. What followed was a parade of crates and boxes being hauled out to my car. My 2004 Ford Explorer was packed to the brim by the time I was done. Each trip out to the parking lot seemed to make my boss more and more panicked. At one point, she tried to argue that some of the equipment was company property, but I shut her down by pointing out that every piece was labeled with my name and had been purchased with my own money. The situation reached its climax when I asked for access to the arena's AV booth and catwalk. My boss's face turned pale as I explained that several cameras I had loaned to the events team were installed there. With the corporate representative in tow, I climbed up to the booth and began disconnecting my equipment. It felt surreal, like I was the Grinch stealing Christmas, but instead of ornaments and presents, I was taking back the tools I had spent years investing in. By the time I drove away, I was heartbroken. I had given so much to this company, and they had discarded me without a second thought. But as I looked in my rearview mirror at the stacks of gear filling my car, I couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. They had made their decision, and now they would have to live with the consequences. The fallout was swift. Without my equipment, the company struggled to produce their events at the same level of quality. Their new hire was inexperienced and overwhelmed, and within a year, the company folded entirely. While I can't say for sure that my departure was the sole cause of their downfall, I like to think I played a part in it. If they had treated me fairly and invested in the necessary resources, they might still be in business today. Looking back, that job was one of the most toxic environments I've ever worked in. The lack of support, the unrealistic expectations, and the constant pressure to do more with less took a toll on me. But in the end, I came out stronger, and I learned an important lesson: never let a company take advantage of you. This next story happened a few years ago, but it's one I think about often because of how everything played out. I worked for a company that demanded an incredible amount of flexibility and effort from its employees. My responsibilities included graphic design, video editing, live event AV, and even photography, pretty much everything related to media production. Over the years, my workload grew heavier, as the company continued to add more tasks to my plate without hiring additional help. At first, I was willing to go above and beyond. I loved my work, and I wanted to see the events I was a part of succeed. However, there came a point where the expectations became unreasonable. Not only was I expected to manage multiple roles, but the company also refused to pay for the tools I needed to do my job. As a result, I ended up purchasing almost all of the necessary equipment out of my own pocket. This wasn't cheap. Over time, I built a collection of high-end cameras, lenses, lights, and other AV equipment, all of which were essential for the company's operations. Since the company relied heavily on my equipment for their events and promotions, I made sure to label everything with my name and keep detailed records of all my purchases. By the time I reached my 5th year with the company, my equipment collection was worth thousands of dollars. One day, out of nowhere, I was called into a meeting with my boss. She informed me that the company was downsizing and that my position was being eliminated. I was being replaced by someone fresh out of college, someone younger, cheaper, and inexperienced. To say I was shocked would be an understatement. I had poured my heart and soul into this job, and they were letting me go without a second thought. Adding insult to injury, they sent someone from corporate to oversee my departure. This person followed me to my office and instructed me to pack up my belongings, making it clear that I wouldn't be returning. "Take everything that's yours," they said. So, that's exactly what I did. They had no idea how much of the equipment in the office was mine. As I started packing up my cameras, lights, and other gear, the corporate representative looked confused. My boss, on the other hand, quickly realized what was happening. With every crate of equipment I loaded into my car, her panic grew. It wasn't just the equipment in my office, I also had to retrieve the gear I had lent out for events. This included cameras and AV equipment installed in the arena's catwalk and control booth. When I asked for access to the booth, my boss's face turned white. She tried to argue that some of the equipment belonged to the company, but I calmly explained that every piece was labeled with my name. I even offered to show her the receipts to prove ownership. By the time I was done, my car was packed to the roof with crates of equipment. It took several trips to load everything, and each trip seemed to make my boss more nervous. As I drove away, I felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, I was heartbroken that the company I had given so much to had treated me so poorly. On the other hand, I felt a sense of vindication. They had taken me for granted, and now they were paying the price. After my departure, the company struggled to maintain the same level of quality in their events. The new hire, while undoubtedly talented, lacked the experience and resources needed to manage everything. Without my equipment, the company had to start from scratch, and it quickly became clear that they were unprepared for the challenges ahead. Within a year, the company folded. While I can't say for certain that my departure was the sole cause of their downfall, it's hard to ignore the timing. They had built their operations around my work and my equipment, and without me, they simply couldn't keep up. Looking back, I have no regrets about how I handled the situation. That job was toxic, and the company's unwillingness to invest in its employees ultimately led to its demise. If there's one thing I've learned from that experience, it's this: know your worth, and don't let anyone take advantage of you. This story takes me back to a time when malicious compliance was my best tool for dealing with a toxic coworker. For a bit of context, I was working in a hospital sanitation department, where I held a float worker position. This role meant I was trained in nearly every area of the hospital and could fill in for coworkers who were out sick, on vacation, or otherwise unavailable. The downside was that I didn't know where I'd be assigned until I showed up for my shift each day. While the uncertainty could be challenging, it also kept things interesting. I got to know people all over the hospital and built good relationships with nurses, doctors, and other staff. The one time I wasn't excited about my assignment was when I had to spend a month covering in the operating room, OR. Normally, I wouldn't have minded the OR, it was clean, relatively quiet, and came with a manageable workload. But it also came with Steve. Steve was one of the most notorious employees in our department. He worked the afternoon shift, coming in at 11 a.m. and staying until 7:30 p.m. From the moment I met him, I knew he would be a problem. Steve had a habit of micromanaging everyone around him. If you were even slightly behind schedule or didn't do something the way he wanted, he'd call the supervisor to complain. On top of that, he constantly made condescending comments, particularly toward women. He had told me more than once that I didn't belong in a physically demanding job and should be at home in the kitchen. During my first week in the OR, I made sure to stay on top of my tasks to avoid giving Steve any ammunition. But by the second week, the OR became incredibly busy. Normally, the OR handles about 35 cases a day across its 10 rooms. That week, we averaged 52 cases a day. The pace was brutal, and everyone on the team was struggling to keep up. One day, around noon, I had just finished cleaning 2 rooms and was preparing to take my lunch break. I checked my area to make sure everything was in order before I left. The sinks were clean, the trash bins weren't full, and the hallways had been dusted. Confident that I had done my part, I informed the team that I was heading to lunch. Everyone was fine with this, except Steve. Steve stopped me on my way out and started grilling me about my work. "Did you check your sinks?" he asked. "Yes, I cleaned them this morning," I replied. "What about the trash bins?" he continued. "They're fine," I said, growing increasingly annoyed. "One of them is only half full, and it's not going to overflow in the next 30 minutes. Despite my answers, Steve kept pushing. "Did you dust the hallways? Did you clean the high-touch surfaces?" At this point, I had had enough. "Steve," I said firmly, "you need to mind your own business. You're not my boss. Worry about your own area." Without waiting for a response, I walked away and headed to the OR break room. I sat down, put in my earbuds, and started eating my lunch. 10 minutes later, the department director walked in. She tapped me on the shoulder and asked me to meet her in her office after my break. When I asked what it was about, she said we'd discuss it then. I immediately knew Steve had reported me. This wasn't the first time he had complained about a coworker, and I suspected he had exaggerated the situation to make me look bad. But instead of worrying, I decided to let Steve's plan backfire. I finished my lunch, packed up my things, and made my way to the director's office. On the way, I passed Steve, who looked panicked as the OR workload continued to pile up. "Where are you going?" he demanded. "We have rooms to clean." The director called me to her office, I replied with a smile. "I'll be back when I'm done." When I arrived at the director's office, she was waiting with an HR representative. She explained that someone had filed a complaint about a hostile work environment and had specifically mentioned me. I couldn't help but laugh. "Let me tell you what really happened," I said. I described Steve's behavior in detail, from his constant micromanagement to his inappropriate comments. I explained how he had tried to prevent me from taking my lunch break, even though I had completed all my tasks. The director listened carefully, nodding as I spoke. The HR representative, meanwhile, seemed amused by the entire situation. After I finished, the director sighed and said, "I shouldn't have involved HR without getting your side of the story first." She admitted that Steve's complaint had initially been taken at face value, but hearing my account made her realize that the issue wasn't me, it was Steve. Relieved, I got up to leave, but then I hesitated. "Actually," I said, "I'd like to file a formal complaint about Steve." The director looked surprised but nodded, motioning for me to sit back down. I detailed Steve's behavior, listing every instance of micromanagement, inappropriate remarks, and bullying. I even mentioned the time he had made a sexist comment about me belonging in the kitchen. By the time I was done, the director was shaking her head in disbelief. "It's a bad day to be Steve," I said with a grin. Yes, it is, she replied. After my formal complaint, the director promised to take immediate action. She assured me that she would speak with Steve before the end of the day to address the issues I had raised. Feeling vindicated, I left her office and returned to the operating room, By the time I got back, the team looked absolutely exhausted. The workload had been relentless, and even the most experienced members of the team were visibly drained. Steve, however, was the first to approach me. "Took you long enough," he said with an accusatory tone. "Where were you?" I smiled, savoring the moment. "Oh, don't worry," I said. "You'll find out soon enough." My meeting with the director went really well. The morning shift worker, curious about my cryptic response, asked what had happened. I explained. Someone filed a complaint about me being aggressive, and it turned into a discussion about eliminating the hostile work environment. Hearing this, Steve's smug demeanor returned. "Good," he said, as if he were the one championing workplace harmony. "The last thing we need is someone making people feel uncomfortable around here." I couldn't resist the opportunity to turn the tables. "Oh, absolutely, Steve," I said with exaggerated enthusiasm. "We wouldn't want anyone feeling attacked or disrespected, right? Oh, by the way, have you checked the break room yet? Last I saw, the trash was overflowing onto the floor." Steve's expression instantly changed. He rushed off to check the break room, and the rest of the team burst out laughing. It was a small, petty victory, but it felt incredibly satisfying. A few days later, the director called me back to her office to update me on the actions taken against Steve. Since I was the one who had filed the formal complaint, I was entitled to know the outcome. She explained that while my complaints were taken seriously, they couldn't fire Steve outright because I was the only one who had come forward. Without corroborating reports from other employees, they didn't have enough evidence to terminate his employment. That said, Steve wasn't let off the hook. He was issued 2 strikes, a third strike would result in automatic termination, and was required to complete a year-long series of online training courses. These courses covered topics like workplace discrimination, harassment prevention, and how to foster a more inclusive and respectful environment. Additionally, he was warned in no uncertain terms that any future inappropriate comments or behavior would lead to his immediate dismissal. He was also told that if he crossed the line again, he would be blacklisted from all hospitals in the state. Though I was slightly disappointed that Steve wasn't fired, I was satisfied with the outcome. The reprimand forced him to confront his behavior, and the threat of termination seemed to keep him in check, for the most part. While he still acted resentful toward me, he stopped micromanaging my work and kept his inappropriate comments to himself. In the weeks following the incident, things began to improve for me. The director recognized my hard work and dedication, and I was offered a promotion to a lead position on the day shift. This came with a pay raise, additional responsibilities, and, most importantly, a fancy new title. While I still retained my float status and continued to cover for coworkers as needed, the promotion gave me more authority and respect within the department. With my new position, I was better equipped to stand up to people like Steve. Knowing that I had the director's support and a formal title to back me up gave me the confidence to handle workplace conflicts more effectively. As for Steve, his demeanor changed noticeably after his reprimand. While he still seemed to hold a grudge against me, he became much more cautious in his interactions with others. The days of him openly criticizing and micromanaging his coworkers were over, and the OR felt like a more peaceful place without his constant interference. Of course, I didn't let Steve off the hook entirely. Whenever he tried to assert himself or act superior, I reminded him, subtly but effectively, that he was on thin ice. For example, if he asked me to double-check something I had already completed, I'd reply with a polite but pointed remark like, "Of course, Steve. I wouldn't want anyone to think I wasn't doing my job properly." This entire experience taught me a lot about standing up for myself in the workplace. Before this incident, I had often hesitated to speak out against unfair treatment, fearing retaliation or negative consequences. But after seeing how the director and HR handled my complaint, I realized that I had the right to demand a respectful and supportive work environment. It also reinforced the importance of documenting incidents and advocating for myself. By keeping track of Steve's behavior and providing specific examples in my complaint, I was able to make a strong case that couldn't be dismissed as hearsay. While I don't wish for anyone to deal with a coworker like Steve, I'm grateful for the growth and opportunities that came out of this situation. The promotion, the pay raise, and the improved work environment all made the challenges worthwhile. And knowing that I played a role in holding Steve accountable for his actions gave me a sense of pride and accomplishment. In the end, malicious compliance wasn't just a way to deal with Steve, it was a way to reclaim my power and make the workplace a better place for everyone. And while Steve's antics may have caused plenty of headaches along the way, they also served as a reminder that sometimes, the best way to deal with a problem is to let it implode on its own.